Final Fantasy is one of the most critically acclaimed and best-selling video game franchises to ever see the light of day. Despite the sheer quantity of games that have been released in this series, it's maintained an unprecedented level of quality throughout its history, with many Final Fantasy titles being considered among the greatest games of all time. In order to do the history of Final Fantasy justice, we're splitting this topic into two parts, with this video covering the early days at Square up to and including Final Fantasy VII. Before we begin, we publish new content all week long, so be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. In the early to mid-80s, Square was a software company mainly making games and programs for personal computers. A young Hironobu Sakaguchi left college early to take a job at the company and push them toward entering the video game console market. Square released a few semi-successful titles for the Nintendo Famicom in Japan in the mid-80s, but sales were low. With Square facing financial trouble from low sales, Sakaguchi grew pessimistic about the video game industry and decided his next game would be his last before returning to college.
One more game left on my contract, and then I'm free to pursue my real dreams. Hip-hop. Yes, it's time for my final game, my final fantasy.
Before it came to North America as Dragon Warrior in 1989, the release of Dragon Quest by Enix in 1986 proved that RPGs could be commercially successful outside of Dungeons & Dragons style tabletop games. Sakaguchi took inspiration from Enix's RPG, along with The Legend of Zelda, and amassed a small team to set to work on his role-playing vision. In the role of creator and designer, Sakaguchi modeled the game's battle system on D&D, where he included weaknesses to different elements, turn-based combat, and the ability to create one's character. When it came to the game's design, Square, liking what they saw, eventually added a B team to assist Sakaguchi's A team, and both groups worked to create the game's world and gameplay elements before forming the story, making it the only title in the series to not be built around the storyline. The narrative borrowed heavily from medieval fantasy tales and followed four warriors of light on their quest to rescue a princess and save the world from dark forces. Pretty standard fantasy stuff, really. Final Fantasy was released in Japan in 1987 and became such a success that work began on a sequel immediately, even before the North American release of the game in 1990. All told, the original release and re-releases have sold over 2 million copies, and the game became the gold standard for RPGs at the time, helping to legitimize the genre. Not too bad for a last-ditch effort. Let's just say that Sakaguchi didn't go back to college.
Final Fantasy II? That doesn't even make sense! Okay. One more game.
The next two entries in the Final Fantasy series would not be released in North America, however, as a limited budget and time constraints limited the game's releases to Japan only, though they would be released in the West in anthology editions in the 2000s. Both Final Fantasy II and III were Sakaguchi-directed projects, both began with a story and the gameplay was built around the narrative, and both offered new innovations that would stick with the series for some time, like the introduction of chocobos and the job change character class system. Neither came close to the success of the first game though, as the limited release hurt the game's sales and legacies overall. Uncertain as to when the new console generation would hit, and if it would be a success, Square began developing two games in unison, Final Fantasy IV for Nintendo and Final Fantasy V for the Super Nintendo. The company bit off a little more than they could chew, however, and like most things in life, time and money became a huge factor, and forced Square to scrap the Nintendo game and retitle the Super Nintendo game Final Fantasy IV. This time the game was released in both Japan and North America in 1991, but because the previous two titles were not released in North America, the fourth game was titled Final Fantasy II in the Western world. The game added save points, an addictive time battle system, and an assembled cast for the first time. The plot follows Cecil, a dark knight, as he tries to prevent a sorcerer from seizing powerful crystals and destroying the world. The game was a huge critical success like the previous games, but also a massive commercial success as well, selling well over 2 million units. Seeing as Final Fantasy I and IV were big hits in North America, Square wanted to make a more simplified version of the fantasy RPG specifically for American audiences, and since the development of their fifth entry in the series was shaping up to be the deepest and most difficult yet, the powers that be at Square decided to release a dumbed-down Final Fantasy in 1992. Titled Final Fantasy Mythic Quest, the game was a rare miss for Square, as it was deemed too easy, linear, and restricted. The North American audiences had grown to love the complexity of the Final Fantasy series, and they were not happy to have gotten a lame duck version of their favourite RPG. Further complicating matters, the localization of the immensely popular and successful Final Fantasy V from Japanese to English was marred in problems, and eventually it was deemed too difficult and serious for Americans, and thus cancelled. Back in Japan, however, the fifth game sold as much as the first and fourth in only a matter of months, leaving a sour taste in the mouths of many Western fans. So much so that a hacker group later released a fully fan-translated version of the game without permission. Due to the immense success of the series in Japan, Sakaguchi was promoted to Executive Vice President of Square, and thus a new team took over the development for Final Fantasy VI, with Sakaguchi acting as producer. Two members of the Final Fantasy V team directed it, in Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito, and would oversee the success of the series for some time. As a send-off to the 16-bit era, the story was prioritized and completed by a team of writers, not just one person, and thus emerged one of the best villains of all time in Kefka, a deeply tragic tale steeped in complex themes, the use of subplots, flashbacks, and for the first time, the introduction of a steampunk setting. The presentation, cinematics, and cutscenes were all prioritized as well, making for the most movie-like game in the series thus far. Since the fifth game was not released in North America, anticipation for Final Fantasy VI was at a fever pitch, and the game delivered in 1994, and then some. It went on to receive perfect or near-perfect scores on both sides of the Pacific, while being titled Final Fantasy III in North America, and sold extremely well, being considered one of the greatest RPGs ever made. Speaking of the greatest RPG ever made, Square couldn't have known it, but they were about to follow up their beloved Final Fantasy VI with a game that would become synonymous with RPGs, reinvent the genre, and have critics hailing it as a masterpiece. In every sense, 1997's Final Fantasy VII was a new beginning for not only Square, but for RPGs as a whole. Gone was this series' loyalty to Nintendo, as the N64 simply couldn't handle Square's vision of the game, and so the company decided to throw it in with Sony. Also aiding this decision was the fact that by now Square had made a small fortune off the series, and could finally spend some real money to create their ultimate vision. $80 million to be exact. The team grew to 4 times the size of the sixth game, and Yoshinori Kitase directed once again. While the gameplay system was largely unchanged aside from the introduction of limit breaks, CGI, 3D graphics, and full motion video became the game's focal points. and it hooked North American gamers especially with its emphasis on presentation and story. In Japan, it was equally important, essentially causing the whole Japanese RPG market to follow suit, which largely left the N64 devoid of role-playing games as a result. The title was a resounding success, selling over 10 million copies and winning numerous Game of the Year awards worldwide. The astronomical sales ensured that many spin-offs would be made. Known as the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, this extended universe includes a feature-length film, Advent Children, an animated film called Last Order, a mobile game, a third-person shooter, and a PSP game. That's a whole lot of Final Fantasy VII content.
Oh yeah!
Outside of the main series, Final Fantasy Tactics drew critical praise for its differing game engine and battle system in 1997, but it couldn't compete with Final Fantasy VII. Very little could. But with such a huge success on their hands, how would Square ever manage to top it? Stick around for part 2 of our history of Final Fantasy to find out. Check out these other great clips from MojoPlays and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.